All right, so here we are again. This time I've split the script up again. I'll of course post this as one big script. I want to run through some of these transaction examples from the Atomicity lecture. What I'll do, just like before, is I have added all of the data from the products table and of course the usual create statements and this trigger to this file, so I can just keep rerunning this. We see, just like usual, we've got our drop statements here, drop function if exists, and also this. It's good to maybe stick, when you play with transactions, put a rollback command at the very beginning, because if you get halfway into a transaction and it fails, you need to issue the rollback command to tell the database that you're giving up on the transaction. If you just put one at the top of your script, you're always allowed to roll back if you're not in a transaction. And that's a good way. Otherwise, if you have a failed transaction, any queries you send in will be rejected. It'll say, sorry, you're in the middle of a transaction that just failed. What are you doing? So this rollback is a good way of getting out of that. Okay, so I'll run this. I guess I'll just show this off. It's very similar to our consistency example, except that I've added deferrable to our foreign key constraints. I've added this minimum size trigger, like in the lecture, where every order has to have at least 2 items, and then I've attached it to the table, and I've made it deferrable there. I also attach the same constraint to the orders table, because I don't want anybody adding an order or anything to order contents if the result would be that the order contains fewer than 2 items. It's worth, I guess I should also do on insert, update, or delete, because of course I could add too many items then delete a bunch of them, so I should be careful about that. Okay, and so then I add the data for products. In this version, I'm leaving the order and order contents tables empty because I want to play with those in my data. So I'll run this. All right. And then I'm over here. We'll just make sure products has everything in it. Looks good. So let's start a transaction. Okay, so here is an order with 3 things. And actually, I'll also try selecting from every other table just to show that they're, well, so we can see what's in them. Order contents. Okay, so they're both empty to begin with. Okay, so the first thing is I'm going to see what happens if I try running this by itself. I can't remember if dbeaver how it'll interpret this. Okay, good. So if I just highlight a single bit of the transaction and I run with Control Enter, dbeaver runs it as its own statement, just by itself, not in the transaction. And we can see that if I do that, it says, sorry, you can't make an order. It contains too few items. If I try running this line by itself, it says, sorry, I've never heard of order 1001 before because you haven't added it yet. So the issue is, of course, if I can't add order 1001 because it has too few items, how can I add stuff to order 1001 so that it won't have too few items? And the answer is, well, I use a transaction. So first, let's see what happens if I use a transaction and I don't defer the constraints. So I start transaction. Okay, great. The transaction's been started. And then I try inserting my first value. And it says, sorry, can't do it. The order's still too small. So the issue here is that by default, when you run a transaction, every statement is run in order. And if a constraint is violated, then you have an error. And just to be clear, let's try running this. Notice how this is going to be invalid anyway. But notice how the error it gives is, sorry, you're in the middle of an aborted transaction. And I'll try running something else too, the select statement. Sorry, you're in the middle of an aborted transaction. So once you're in a transaction and an error occurs, your database connection gets invalidated, basically. And that means that until you roll back the transaction you were doing, it won't take any more commands. It'll say, I'm sorry, you're in the middle of a transaction. Sort that out before you do anything else. So I'll issue a rollback command. Now, just to be clear, if you were to just disconnect and run away, the database would roll back for you. The connection ending counts as rolling back, but you can't keep using the connection until you roll back. Okay, so I rolled back. So we'll try again. I'm going to bring back the set constraints deferred. Okay, so I start my transaction. That looks good. I set constraints deferred. That looks good. I insert my value into orders. Okay, everything's good there. And then I insert into order contents this value here. Let's just try committing right now. It says can't do it. Order contains too few items because I only got to these 2 statements before I hit commit. So I'll roll back again. Okay, we'll start again. This time we'll actually follow it all the way through. I create the order, I add 1 item, I add a second item, I add a third item, and then I commit. And it worked. The commit succeeded. I got no errors. If I select from orders, my result is there. If I select from order contents, my result is there. Okay, so we'll try down here. Now, if I run this command by itself, we can say foreign key problem. Because the foreign key, obviously, there is no order 1002. Why am I allowed to add stuff to it if it doesn't exist yet? If instead I start a transaction, defer the constraints, and then add it, it lets me do it because the foreign key constraint has been deferred until the end of the transaction. I add the order, which means by the time I get to the commit where I enforce the constraints, there is an order 1002, and so it succeeds. So we'll just verify that. There are my two orders, and there's the contents of each. All right, let's try order number 1003. This shouldn't be too exciting. All right, so it was added to the table. We'll verify that. Great. Okay, good. So that's not terribly exciting. Let's take a look at this. Now remember that if a transaction fails, we'll need a rollback. So I'll just put one up there for easy access. Okay, so here I try to create an order with only one item. So I run this, and we already saw this. I run every command in order faithfully, and it says, sorry, can't do it. So I'll roll back. Now, one thing to note is that when you are inside of a transaction, so you've connected to the database, you've sent start transaction, you've said defer constraints, you've run insert. If you run a select statement here, let's try this. So I start the transaction over again, I defer constraints, I add something to orders, and now in the middle of my transaction, I select star from orders. Notice that the new order I just added is there. But wait a minute, I thought we weren't allowed to put stuff in the database until the commit statement. So when you're connected and you're in the middle of your own transaction, you can see the results of your transaction so far. But nobody else can. The rest of the database cannot see it until the commit statement has been run. It's not permanent. It's only visible to you. And then when you hit, so then I'll finish this, insert into order contents, and we'll just verify that if I select star from order contents, it's in there. The reason this is important is there could be things you do in the middle of your own transaction that rely on the data being in the tables where you expected it to be. I mean, I just added something to order contents. I expect to see it there. Okay, so now I hit commit. And it says, wait, never mind, you can't, that wasn't allowed. That whole operation is considered to have failed. So and so if I now try and query the tables, if I go back up here and I do select star from products, it says, wait, whoops. Sorry, I guess the commit failed, so I don't need to automatically roll back. But in this case, what you see while you're running a transaction, let me find it here. What you see when you're running a transaction is whatever the transaction has produced so far, but that's not what the database actually contains. It's only visible to you because maybe the rest of your transaction depends on you seeing the results of other things. Now, I want to show what rollback does if you run it yourself. So Control-Enter, start transaction, set constraints, okay. Insert into orders this invalid order. We know that's going to fail. But there it is, apparently there. And then I roll back myself. Okay, so I end my transaction and I roll it back. If I go look at orders, that order is now gone. So it's been removed. And arguably, nobody ever saw it there. It was only visible to me while I was in the middle of creating that order. So we'll try the same thing here. This was the second to last example from the slides. Whoops, we'll find the backspace key. Okay, so we start our transaction, looking good. We set the constraints to be deferred. Okay, we add 3 items to order contents. We could now go and verify. They do appear to be there, but if I try to commit, it says can't do it. There is no order 9999. And then finally, let's take a look at this one. Order 8888. So here I add an order, but I don't add any items to it. Okay, works. Commit, gives me an error. It says order is too small. Now I'll add some comments to this when I post it, some things to try yourself to play with, because I think getting comfortable with this idea requires actually running some statements. There is one thing I want to do right myself just at the end of this video here to get you started into thinking about this, which is, okay, down here, I was able to create order 1002 in a funny reverse order because the foreign key constraints here were deferred. What happens if I set the foreign key constraints to not be deferrable? So here's order contents. The foreign key constraint in question is the one on order number. So I'm going to delete this word deferrable, and then I'm going to recreate the schema. Okay. So I will start the transaction as usual. I will defer all of my constraints, and then I do this, and it says, sorry, you can't do it. Even though I was allowed to do it before, I can't do it now. And the reason is because the foreign key constraint isn't deferrable. So even though I requested that constraints were deferred, that constraint didn't get deferred. Only deferrable constraints get deferred. So if I have a non-deferrable constraint, it's my problem to fix it now. Whoops, I can't run it like that. I have to actually make sure the constraint is observed at every line, even inside a transaction. And so that, of course, means that if you ever foresee a case where you need to allow to resolve a chicken and egg problem, you need to mark the constraint as deferrable, because it's not sufficient just to say set constraints all deferred. Only constraints that are explicitly deferrable can be deferred. So when I post this, take a look at the code yourself. Try running the transactions yourself and play with this, because on assignment 6, I don't think deferred constraints are too tough, but I think that there's a lot of notation and a lot of quirks to how it works, and playing with it yourself is, I think, the easiest way of resolving that.